April 1986. A small boat comes into harbour at the Isles of Scilly, a scatter of rocks and beaches about 28 miles off the tip of Cornwall, where roughly 2,000 people live and almost nothing happens. A Dutch diplomat steps off. He is met by the chairman of the local council. There are handshakes. Somebody has laid on refreshments. And then, in front of a modest crowd of islanders, the ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands signs a peace treaty, ending a war against these islands that had been running uninterrupted for 335 years. Nobody had died in it. Nobody had fought in it. For 3 centuries, almost nobody had even known about it. The ambassador joked that it must have been rather unsettling for the islanders, knowing the Dutch could have attacked at any moment. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a war starts, gets forgotten for 3 centuries, and then has to be formally ended by a man in a good coat on a beach. And you'll understand something more uncomfortable: whether this war ever legally existed at all. Start with the islands, because the islands explain everything. The Isles of Scilly are the last thing before the Atlantic. Granite, sand, and weather. On a map of Europe, they are a rounding error. But look at that map like a 17th century sailor, and they stop being remote and start being strategic. Everything sailing into the channel from the Atlantic, every merchant ship carrying wine, salt, timber, silver, passes them. Which means whoever holds those rocks can see the shipping lanes of Europe from their front step. That is worth remembering. Nobody fought over Scilly because it was valuable in itself. They fought over it because of what you could reach from it. To understand why anyone is on those rocks in 1651, you need the mess happening next door. England had spent most of the 1640s tearing itself apart. Parliament against the king. Charles I, over money, religion, and who was actually allowed to be in charge. Parliament won, and in January 1649, they did something that shocked every court in Europe. They put the king on trial, and then they executed him. Publicly. In the street. In front of a crowd. You cannot overstate how far outside the rules this was. Kings lost wars all the time. They were captured, exiled, quietly murdered. They were not tried by their own subjects and beheaded in daylight as a matter of policy, which left the people who had fought for the king with a problem. Their cause was finished on the mainland, so they went where Parliament's armies were slowest to reach, the far west. Ireland, the Channel Islands, and a scatter of rocks 28 miles off Cornwall, held for the king by a soldier named Sir John Grenville. Here's the practical difficulty with being the last loyal garrison of a dead king. Nobody is paying you. There is no treasury. There is no supply line. There is a rock, a harbour, some hungry soldiers, and a number of perfectly good ships. So the royalists at Scilly did what men with ships and no wages have always done. They started taking other people's cargo. Officially, this wasn't piracy. Officially, it was privateering, attacking enemy shipping with the blessing of a legitimate authority. The distinction mattered enormously to lawyers and not at all to the crew of the ship being boarded. And who was sailing past those rocks fat with cargo more than anyone else in Europe? The Dutch. The Dutch Republic in the middle of the 17th century was the great commercial machine of the world. More merchant ships than anyone. Trade routes to Asia, the Baltic, the Americas. If you wanted to rob somebody at sea in 1650, statistically, you were going to rob a Dutchman. There was also politics in it. The Dutch had leaned toward Parliament. So from the royalist view, Dutch cargo wasn't just profitable, it was fair game. The Dutch view was simpler. They were losing ships to a garrison of desperate men on a rock. And nobody was compensating them for it. So the Dutch sent someone to deal with it. And this is where the story stops being funny for a second, because the man they sent was not a minor official. Martin Harpert-Soon Tromp was one of the finest naval commanders of the age, the kind of figure who gets streets named after him. When the Dutch Republic had a problem at sea, Tromp was the answer. On the 30th of March, 1651, his fleet arrived off the Isles of Scilly. He made a demand, compensation for the Dutch ships and goods taken by the men on those rocks. He did not get a satisfactory answer. We know what happened next from a letter recorded a few weeks later in the memoirs of a politician named Bulstrode Whitelocke. Tromp, it says, had been to Scilly to demand reparation, and receiving no satisfactory answer, he had, according to his commission, declared war on them. Hold on to that phrase. According to his commission. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it's going to take the floor out from under this entire story. But note what he declared war on. Not England, not Parliament, not the King's cause. He declared war on the Isles of Scilly, a specific set of rocks, and the men standing on them. Now, having declared war, Tromp is presumably about to fight one. He never does, because in June, barely 2 months later, Parliament finally gets round to Scilly properly. An admiral named Robert Blake arrives with a parliamentarian force, and the royalist garrison, out of options and out of food, surrenders, and there was real fighting to take those islands. Men died at Scilly in 1651. But not in this war. That was Englishmen against Englishmen, the tail end of a civil war. The Dutch had come for reparations, and the problem had just been solved for them by somebody else. So the Dutch fleet turned around and went home, without firing a shot. That is the entire military history of the 335 Years' War. A demand, a refusal, a declaration, and a fleet sailing away because the argument had already ended. What nobody does, and this is the whole story, is end it on paper. There is no treaty, no formal peace, nothing that says the state of war between the Dutch Republic and the Isles of Scilly is concluded. Why would there be? The garrison had surrendered, the ships had stopped, everyone involved considered the matter closed. And a year later, in 1652, the Dutch Republic and England went to war properly. A real war with real fleets and real casualties, the first of 3. Next to that, a declaration against some rocks was not worth the ink. So it sat there, technically live, completely ignored. And then time does what time does. Tromp is killed in battle 2 years later, in 1653. Blake dies in 1657. The men on the rocks scatter into ordinary lives. England restores its monarchy, loses it again, gets a Dutch king, genuinely, in 1688. The Dutch Republic ends. The Netherlands becomes a kingdom. Empires rise, industrialize, and fall. 2 world wars are fought, in which Britain and the Netherlands are allies. Aeroplanes are invented. Radio, television, people walk on the moon. And in a filing system somewhere, entirely undisturbed, one 17th century declaration of war against 28 square kilometers of Cornish granite technically remains in force. Nobody is enforcing it. Nobody is thinking about it. That's the thing about paperwork. It doesn't need you to believe in it. It just needs nobody to file the next piece. Now here's my favorite part of this entire story, and it's the part people usually get backwards. By the 20th century, there's a local story on Scilly, a bit of pub knowledge, the sort of thing islanders tell visitors. You know we're technically still at war with Holland, and in 1985, a man named Roy Duncan, a local historian and chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, decides he's had enough of it. He is not trying to make this story famous. He is trying to kill it. He thinks it's nonsense and he wants it settled. So he writes to the Dutch embassy in London and, in effect, asks them to confirm that the whole thing is a myth. The embassy goes and checks and comes back and tells him, "We can't find a peace treaty. The myth is accurate." At which point Roy Duncan, having comprehensively failed to debunk anything, does the only reasonable thing available to a man in his position. He invites the Dutch ambassador over to end the war. And on the 17th of April, 1986, the ambassador, Jonker Heidekoper, flies to a small island off Cornwall and signs a peace treaty with the Isles of Scilly. 335 years. 0 shots, 0 casualties. And he makes the joke that it must have been terrible for the islanders living all that time knowing the Dutch could have attacked at any moment. Everybody laughs. Somebody takes a photograph. It's a lovely day. Which brings us back to that phrase, according to his commission. Because here is what a lot of historians will tell you, and it is not comfortable for the story we've just spent 15 minutes enjoying. There are 2 serious problems. The first is Tromp's authority. A commission is a set of instructions. Whether Tromps actually gave him the power to declare a war, as opposed to demanding compensation or taking action against specific ships, is genuinely questioned. Admirals could do a great deal on their own initiative. Declaring war on behalf of a republic is quite far up that list. The second problem is bigger. You cannot really declare war on the Isles of Scilly because the Isles of Scilly were not a country. They were and are a small part of a sovereign state, and a state declaring war on a region of another state isn't a normal act. It isn't clear it's a valid one. The islands had no capacity to make war or peace or anything else because they were never a party in their own right. So the skeptical reading goes like this. An admiral, annoyed, made a declaration he may not have been entitled to make against an entity that could not receive it. Nothing followed from it. Nothing was enforced by it, and 3 centuries later, some extremely charming people held a ceremony to end a thing that had never legally started. I want to be straight with you. I don't know which reading is right, nor, honestly, does anyone. This story lives in letters and memoirs and secondary accounts, not in a clean archive. The evidence is thin, and thin evidence is exactly the soil that stories like this grow in. But I don't think that ruins it. I think it's the point. Because look at what actually happened here. A piece of paper was created in 1651 and never cancelled. For 335 years, it did nothing at all. No soldiers, no ships, no consequences, no victims. It existed purely as an unclosed file. And then in 1986, 2 governments took it seriously enough to send a diplomat to a beach. Not because anyone was in danger. Because there was a loose end, and loose ends are uncomfortable. Because the tidiest way to deal with a war that may never have existed is to formally end it anyway. That is the most human thing in this entire story. Faced with a piece of 17th century paperwork that was probably invalid and definitely harmless, the response of 2 modern nations was, well, we'd better sign something. So, was it the longest war in history? Probably not. Probably it was never a war at all. But somewhere there is a document, signed in April 1986, ending a conflict between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and 28 square kilometers of rock in the Atlantic. And that document is completely real, which means that whatever did or didn't happen in 1651, the peace, at least, definitely counts.